Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you may be watching or listening to episode 2 of the Carving It Up podcast, the President's Edition, U.S. President's Edition, more specifically. I am Bryson Carver. As always, Isaac Lawson will join me in just a second. But if you watched or listened to episode 1, we appreciate that. We talked about the Founding Fathers. We talked about kind of the baby stages of this country. And as Isaac pointed out at the end of episode 1, kind of in episode 2, we're going to talk more about America's growing pains. We're starting to see a rise in partisanship, which we're going to dive right into in just a second. But the rise in partisanship, we're going to cover John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, and James K. Polk. So we're going to cover 6 presidents today. So sort of transitioning into, at least at the end of this episode, where slavery is starting to become like the issue of the time, but not quite to that area yet. You'll see the transition as we go, starting with John Quincy Adams. But we'll start with the election of 1824. But first, before we get into any of that, let's bring on Isaac Lawson on Carving It Up, U.S. President's Edition. Isaac, can you hear me?
Yes, good to be on here.
Absolutely, man. Great to have you on. So before we even get into anything, what do you want? What should the people listening or watching this to expect from these upcoming next 6 presidents and kind of the state of the nation at this point in our history?
We're going to see really rapid growth. We're going to see, even though in the last episode we discussed some, the kind of the rise of partisanship, we're going to kind of see that become more cemented. But I think the best word though ultimately is growth. We're seeing things change and evolve and get kind of closer to the America that we know today.
That's a good way to look at it. And you start with the election of 1824. So basically, the era of the Founding Fathers is just about over. It's pretty much past. We got the first 5 presidents, Washington to Monroe, and 1824 certainly one of the more colorful and I think controversial would be a more appropriate term, ways to describe this election. So in this day, you got 4 candidates. You've got the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who we discussed at the end of episode 1. You've got, who else? You've got the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. You've got the Secretary of the Treasury, so another member of Monroe's cabinet, a man named William Crawford. And you got this man, Senator Andrew Jackson, who's kind of become the big celebrity of the day, who's really, I think we even touched on this at the end of episode 1. Really, he's more popular than the president. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's kind of where the country's at. And we'll get into Jackson later because, of course, he did wind up serving as president. But through this election, and talk about this a little bit, Jackson is the clear and obvious choice of the people, but...
So the election of 1824 is crazy. So like you said, Jackson was the clear choice of the people. He had a plurality in the popular vote. He had about 41%. But basically what happened was no candidate had enough votes in the Electoral College to actually be declared the winner. So it went to the House of Representatives, which I believe is under I can't remember which amendment off the top of my head. Should have had that in my notes. But it went to the House of Representatives, and basically each congressional delegation from each state would have 1 vote, and basically that's how they decide who is the winner. Henry Clay, the corrupt bargain, which was basically an accusation that Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House and one of the presidential candidates who came in 4th, basically,
and because Isaac, the top 3 went to the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. So Henry Clay's out.
Yes,
but he's the Speaker of the House. That's the real wild card in here.
So he used his kind of sway there among his supporters in the House, and basically told them to vote for Adams, and that's who he wanted. Now this became known as the corrupt bargain because after this, Clay wound up becoming Adams' Secretary of State. Which it's hard to tell if it really was like a bargain, like deal that they made, but clearly it was something that made Clay more favorable to Adams. But this was basically done just to keep Jackson out of office because they viewed him as a danger and a threat to the Union. And they had some legitimate reasons to think that because Jackson had been senator from Tennessee for a little while, and he was known for just kind of having a chaotic run. He wasn't even at the Senate most of the time, and when he was, he would kind of grandstand and just like kind of pick fights with other senators. So for someone like Henry Clay or John Quincy Adams, who were like statesmen and had served in Congress for a long time, it's really understandable why they wouldn't have liked Jackson, especially as they were both people who had better educations and were just kind of used to that Washington society that was still kind of coming around at the time. Why they might not have liked an outsider like Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, and that's Jackson's supporters pretty much went off of this for the next 4 years leading up into the 1828 election, which we still have a minute to get to that. But that's, I mean, it really is one of the most, like you said, chaotic elections, I think, in American history, because what happens basically, like you mentioned, top three, according to the Constitution, the top three, if a winner is not determined in the Electoral College, which was not the case, the top three go to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay is in fourth, but again, he's the Speaker of the House. But I believe William Crawford had a stroke, so he's out. So basically, it comes down to two: it's Adams or Jackson. Yes. And like you mentioned, they pick Adams on the first ballot, and Jackson is incensed at this, and as are his supporters. And as you said, it became known as the corrupt bargain. And really, could you make the argument that this is the first example, maybe, of a more modern, at least what we know today, modern partisanship?
I think this is an early example of it. I think we're seeing, this is probably the best first example of the fractioning of the Jeffersonian Republican Party, which is something that will probably come up in the transition to Jackson at the end of this. But this, let me bring it up now, basically saw all these candidates were running as members of the same party.
Yes.
Which is commonly referred to as the Democratic Republican Party, but they would have just called themselves Republicans. But this fracturing of the party wound up splitting it a couple different ways. The clear path, the clear party that came out of it was the Democratic Party, sometimes called the Jacksonian Democrats, and that would eventually become the Democratic Party of today, although very different at this point in time. You also would have seen as a result of this kind of the early rumblings of the Whigs, but it would take a little while for them to be fully formed. But that's where we see this split is created, is in response to the election of 1824.
Yeah, it was chaotic. And like I said, we're not going to like spend time over like every single election because this is none. I mean, trust me, there are some in here that are fascinating, but this might be at the top of the list, or at least it's certainly up there. And it plays key factor into the Adams administration and what is to follow. So John Quincy Adams is the president at this point. So let's get into him. Number 6, John Quincy Adams, Democratic Republican, 1825 to 1829, 57 years old, from Massachusetts. So John Quincy Adams, he was born on July the 11th of 1767 to, of course, John Adams, the second president of the United States, and Abigail Adams. He married Louise, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Louisa Johnson in 1797. They had 4 children together. And what I think is, we talked about John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, the letters they wrote back and forth to one another post-presidency. And John Adams wrote a letter to John Quincy Adams after he won the election. And I think it's quite fascinating. He said, quote, "No man who ever held the office of president would congratulate a friend upon obtaining it." And so he's saying, good luck. Let's see how much you enjoy this. And so that's kind of, I guess it perfectly captures the vibe of the Adams administration. Not a ton gets done. Adams did want to promote public education, things such as, scientific advancements. He wanted to build roads and canals across America. But his number one issue was he was his father's son.
Yes.
Like John Adams, he was very stubborn, kind of aloof. And so just kind of go into John Quincy Adams' personality and how that's at times hindered some of the good things he did want to get done.
I think stubborn is a really, really good word for him. He just didn't like compromise. He was a better politician, I would say, than his father. He was better at getting things done. But that we saw more in his career in Congress. I
Mhm.
think his background as a diplomat is really interesting. That kind of follows through with some of the previous presidents before him, but he didn't utilize it as much while in the office, from what I remember.
Yeah.
The most notable thing is basically like for his personality with his presidency would just be stubbornness, and it kind of went both ways. His opponents were stubborn, and he was stubborn, and nothing really got done. And I think it's difficult to say whether if he loosened up, if they would have done anything, still just out of pure dislike for him, or if they had loosened up, if he would have actually worked with them. Um, and it's just an interesting predicament because he was a very smart man, and his
Yes.
writings, he was a really good writer. His speeches are really, like I would say, intricate. Like you can tell he thought through what he was writing. Um, but it just wasn't. You can say a lot, you can write a lot, you can be really smart, but if you can't get anything done, that's kind of what it comes down to.
Absolutely. And that's what we see oftentimes. I mean, there's plenty of presidents that have been great with words, and like you mentioned, better congressmen, or at
Hmm.
least more successful than they were in the Oval Office. And so, when you look at John Quincy Adams, like you bring up a good point, because a lot of the Jeffersonian Republicans at the time were on the kind of the corrupt bargain side of things. They were pro Jackson, and so they as well would be somewhat stubborn, or at least not want to work with the president and try and get good things done. Is there anything in your view, or at least of your research, what you know about this guy of note that got done either positively or negatively?
I think the biggest thing is probably while he was president, commercial trade was extended in like to larger areas outside of the U.S. Than it had been before, and that was due to some of his diplomatic efforts. And that's something that is probably not as well known, but ultimately had a larger effect on the country going forward. That's probably the biggest like individual thing that is directly related to his presidency that I could say, like the first establishments between the then Kingdom of Hawaii, and even like trade with Denmark was established formally then between the U.S. and those nations. I think that's notable because those things did affect the U.S. going forward and kind of helped create an economic boom that would last at least for a little while after him.
Yeah, it's a good point, and but that's kind of the issue, is not much did get done
Hmm.
under the John Quincy Adams administration. So, of course, he runs for re-election in 1828, and here's Andrew Jackson once again. So that they run against each other yet again. And the 1828 campaign, I actually talked to a congressman about this a couple months ago when we're talking about partisanship and people being real nasty toward one another. And he said, "Look at 1828 and then talk to me." And
Hmm.
so, I mean, this campaign was straight up nasty on both sides, because you have the current president, or at least people in his camp in his reelection career, I guess, who are throwing out a lot of accusations against Jackson, and actually Jackson's wife, Rachel, which becomes a big
Hmm.
subject at the time. Basically, the the issue with Rachel Jackson, Andrew's wife, was that she had been dating Andrew Jackson while still legally married to of course, to her first husband. And so this was true, and it was actually exposed by a Cincinnati newspaper editor who was friends with Henry Clay.
Hmm.
So this is even a bigger mess now, because Jackson's like, okay, so now you're conspiring to try and get dirt on my wife now. Like this is getting a little out of hand. And
Hmm.
so kind of talk about the back and forth between the two, because both sides are throwing out outrageous sounding, some true, some false accusations at one another.
So Jackson loved to like egg people on. So he would throw things, and he would get reporters to print things about Adams that were basically just flat out insults. Um, like it wasn't even like thinly veiled criticisms or anything. It was just plain out attacks and lies. Um, but on the Adams side, while Adams kind of would like insult Jackson in response, he kind of tried to stay out of it and would kind of let the other people on his side, like his friends, fight his battles for him. Um, but the Rachel Donaldson Donaldson controversy is an important one. It's one that's really kind of defining for that election, and I think is a really good example of how heated things got. So she started dating Jackson while she was still married to her first husband, who had actually left her. He had abandoned her when they were dating, and Jackson paid for her divorce from him. But during this time period, basically when the divorce was filed and Jackson was getting ready to marry, uh, her first husband came back, and basically it kind of caused this whole fuss. And Jackson, it was just a whole mess and issue. And Jackson had to get it all worked out to be able to marry his wife. So digging things like that up, they also attacked her, claiming that she was like overweight and making accusations about that. And I think it was just real kind of like slimy scandals, like the things that you would see in tabloids, but these were running in like the major newspapers of the day. I think that's kind of the best example of it. It's like these little things that were kind of salacious uh, claims about people's personal lives that either context was being removed, or they were just being fabricated.
And that's, when you look at the accusations that the Jackson camp throws at Adams, some of this stuff is like, what on earth? So they accused him of living with his wife before they were married, that he had provided, I couldn't believe this one when I read it, that he had provided an American version for a Russian czar. He bought a pool table for gambling purposes. And so basically this election has almost nothing to do with policy, and basically, whose morale is greater is ultimately what's going to come down to in this election. And when it was all said and done, it was Jackson this time. There was no I guess meeting Congress to decide the winner. And so Henry Clay is pushed to the side here. So Jackson wins. However, his joy of victory is very short lived, because in December of 1828. Rachel died suddenly of a heart attack. I believe she was only 62 years old, if I'm not mistaken. So she dies. This devastates Andrew Jackson. And I read that he had told somebody not long after she passed that he had forgiven those who had attacked him, but as long as he lived, he would never forgive those who had attacked Rachel. And so talk about the impact that her death caused him, and especially right as he's about to become president of the United States.
It definitely put him into a depression. I think that's hard to get around. Jackson is someone who, and as we get into him, I'll talk more about this, clearly had some underlying mental issues. And I think that this just worsened them even further. Rachel was, his wife, obviously, but one of the most important people in his life. And I genuinely think that he wasn't really sure how to go on without her. And I think that without a doubt, he 100% blamed the media for her death. He believed, and there are letters where he basically said along the lines of, if this hadn't happened, if they hadn't attacked her that way, she would still be alive. And, I think, those were kind of unsubstantiated. Like, he didn't know if those attacks had some impact on her health. But it was clearly like, watching your spouse be attacked, and she went into a depression because of the attacks, and then watching her die, and then you're suddenly going into leading your country is a difficult thing for anyone. And I think that that's something that at least starting him off in the presidency just kind of set the tone for kind of a little bit of a darker Andrew Jackson going into the White House.
I think it definitely made him more bitter, without a question. And I mean, like you said, obviously the loss of anybody would be just devastating. But like you said, and like you said, it's unsubstantiated. We don't know for certain if they hadn't attacked her, would she have lived? But I definitely think the stress of it couldn't have helped her physical condition. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's on his part. This is going to be a rare comment, at least on my part. His criticism might have been more than fair in that regard. Now, as for the man who lost the election, the now outgoing president, John Quincy Adams, and we forgot to bring this up about John Adams, he was not exactly gracious in defeat. He left the White House before the inauguration, so he did not attend Andrew Jackson's inauguration. But he became the first ex-president to be reelected to the House of Representatives. And basically, you could make an argument that his post-president, actually, I think you and I would both agree on this, his post-presidential life and career was far more successful than his presidential career.
Definitely, I would completely agree. In that you saw he became a leader in Congress. He pushed for a lot of very progressive and transformative policy for the times, and he eventually became a leader or a leading abolitionist
Yes.
early on. And those were all things that were extremely notable, especially for a former president, son of a president, someone who held cabinet positions. He was someone with a lot of sway and influence, especially as a member of Congress, and definitely was a leading political figure, quite literally right up until his death.
Yeah, and I wish I had the picture. I wasn't able to get it on here, but he was also the first president to have his picture taken, which he was photographed sitting in a chair. And I think 1843 was when it was. So it was the first president to have his picture taken. Now, as you said, up until his death, he actually died at the House of Representatives on February 23rd of 1848. He suffered a cerebral hemorrhage 2 days early in the House. He was 80 years old. And his final words, quite prophetic, or not prophetic, but very deep, I guess. He said, "This is the last of earth. I am content." And so he basically was in public service literally until his final breath. And so I think certainly his post-presidential life, I think, is quite admirable to me.
No, I would completely agree. And something just before we move on from John Quincy Adams that I think is important to bring up about him is what was just his progressive aspirations for the time. Because he did go into the presidency wanting to establish a national college. He wanted to build roads. He wanted to increase public transit. He had a lot of a broad vision domestically, and it was something that there was a lot of pushback against because people viewed it as not the responsibility of the federal government. And honestly, those are still things that are kind of debated about today.
Yeah.
But he had a broad progressive vision there that would have fundamentally transformed the country in an early era that was defeated because nothing could get done. So he was a visionary. He was stubborn and nothing got done, but he also wasn't someone that was just like set in the
Ineffective
past as we
completely.
often view people who are stubborn are. He had a very future forward vision. And again, he was able to get some of that done later on in Congress.
He was, and to his credit, look, he kept going. He didn't just kind of fade off in the sunset. He kept serving until the day he died. Now, here we go. Listen, I'm just going to go ahead and warn the audience out here. Hang on, buckle up, because we are in for a ride with this next president, Andrew Jackson. Number 7, Andrew Jackson, Democrat, 1829 to 1837, 61 years old, from Tennessee. Basically, how I would, at least going into this, sum up the Andrew Jackson presidency, Isaac, is he was always fighting or at war with somebody.
Yes.
He was always at war with somebody. He was born on March the 15th of 1767 to Andrew Jackson Sr. and Elizabeth Hutchinson. Of course, we mentioned his marriage to Rachel in 1794. He raised her 11 children as his own. So they didn't have any children together, but he raised them as his own. Of course, as you mentioned, her husband did leave her and they got divorced. But he was the very first president. We hear this kind of, I guess, narrative about some presidents, some true, some not. We'll get in the one where the narrative is not true. But he was, in fact, the first president to be born in a log cabin. And so kind of he prided himself. It was his mission to make sure that the people knew he was a voice for the common man. That was who he always believed that he was and wanted to be for the American people. So real quick, just a little fun fact. So he was the first Democrat. Again, talking about the modern Democratic Party. Jackson was the first president in history. He basically kind of formed the party. And so a funny story about how the Democratic Party got the mascot of the donkey is again, Andrew Jackson, to use a sports example, he's like the Dallas Cowboys. You either love the Cowboys or you hate the Cowboys. It's the same thing with Andrew Jackson. There's no in between, certainly for that day. And so his opponents called him a jackass, and he liked that so much, he made that he turned that into the mascot of the Democratic Party. And so just an interesting fact about how that came to be. And so he's I wouldn't. He's not stubborn. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the same sense that say the two Adams presidents was, but kind of in a different way, right? Like a little bit.
Yes, I feel like it's hard to kind of pinpoint a good like explanation. He was very stubborn, but he was able to get things done, even when he had congressional opposition. And I wouldn't really describe him as being charismatic. People liked him, but I wouldn't describe him as being charismatic. I think some of it, a little bit, was that people were afraid of him,
Yeah,
which
I
sounds funny
agree.
to say, but I think that does play into it, definitely for Jackson. Um, I think he was someone that people did, he wanted to be the representative of the common man, and I think in a lot of ways at the time he did accomplish that, and I think that kind of ethos kind of helped him kind of drive people to kind of give into his stubbornness. Because he was kind of like, you kind of more of like, I am representing the American public. So if you oppose me, you're opposing them. And even if at all times that wasn't necessarily true, I think that was convincing.
Yeah, I mean that he was more forceful. He had a presence about him. He actually he did not like to be called Mr. President. He preferred to be called General. Of course, he was a general in previous wars before the very important wars. He was a gambler. He had 2 bullets in his body from past duels. He was a guy that would pretty much fight at the drop of a hat. I mean that's really how you would describe him, at least as his personality. He would. I think this is interesting. You talked about his forcefulness and his rage. He had a furious sense of temper, and oftentimes they would have cabinet meetings, and he would yell and scream and just be going off on people. And the cabinet meeting would end. They'd leave the room. He'd get his way, and there'd be one person left. Sometimes it'd be his vice president, John C. Calhoun, at the time, and he'd look at them. And he said they thought I was mad. So he would kind of use his image. It's quite genius, really, for him. He would use his image, his reputation, to get his way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we've had a few future presidents that have done things similar to that, but nothing quite like Jackson. He created, and this has continued on to this day, the spoils system. And so, for those out there that don't know, Jackson, Isaac, explain what the spoil system is and how Jackson created it.
So the spoil system, sorry, one second, let me grab my notes here.
Yeah.
Basically what it would do is if like, so say you're appointing people for a political position, you would basically just pick people who are of your political supporters. So say you volunteered on their campaign or anything like that basically they would be given those sorts of positions. So it became well known for like people say I wanted a good job as an ambassador, then I would kind of slip some money to the right guy in the administration, and then I would get the job I wanted. And this is one, it's also known as the patronage system. It'll come up in later episodes, especially with when we get into like James A. Garfield and Chester A.
Yes.
Arthur. And that's where we see kind of, because this system obviously is problematic, but it at a time when there weren't really a lot of well-qualified people for these positions, it was kind of easy, and it was easy to kind of get people like your political can't talk all of a sudden. It was easy to get your kind of allies politically to kind of stay your allies to continue to be friends with you if you were kind of giving them a reason to stay with you.
Right.
And that was something that Jackson definitely saw like fit, and he would 100% use. And he also kind of didn't care that much. Like it was like, oh, I'm going to make you the ambassador to wherever. Okay, like I don't care.
He didn't realize. At times, actually many times, he would appoint people. We'll see this as we go on. He would appoint people to positions that maybe they weren't really qualified to have, but again, because they helped him. And so, it gives them, like you said, it gives them a reason to be loyal to a certain candidate, to say, hey, you know what? If he wins, I get a job. I'm basically guaranteed a job. So that's what Jackson created. He created the spoil system. And so right off the bat, as he comes in office, we've got a scandal in the Jackson administration that, shocker, has absolutely nothing to do with policy. The Battle of the Petticoats is what they called it at the time. This is interesting. So basically, the wives of Jackson's cabinet members did not want to associate with Jackson's Secretary of War, Peggy Eaton, who was the wife, John Eaton was Jackson's Secretary of War. The wives of the other cabinet members, led by the wife of Vice President Calhoun, didn't want to associate her, basically because it's very similarly to Rachel Jackson. She had dated her future husband before she'd obtained a legal divorce from her previous husband. And so they didn't associate with her. And this infuriated Jackson because he's starting to get now flashbacks to the campaign and what led to that. And so talk about the Battle of the Petticoats, and I guess that's a perfect way to describe it, is petty. But just explain that to people and just what all went down with this.
Basically, it was just kind of like a stupid fight. And basically just the wives of the different cabinet members would kind of get together and like hang out and go to social functions, as one does when they're a high-ranking person in DC. And basically they would just not invite Peggy Eaton because they didn't like her, but then she was the only one being left out. And it was noticeable to other people in DC what was going on. And then it also was causing a problem for her and therefore her husband and the other cabinet members. Now, this also led to like more rumors being spread about her, and kind of like inflating the whole situation with her and her husband, to making accusations about her and saying that before she was even married to her first husband that she was, kind of off going crazy, which there's not really a lot of evidence for.
Right.
It was just kind of rumor. And then basically it got so bad, and the infighting around it kind of got so bad that basically they went and tattled to Jackson, and both sides were kind of like, either you drive the Eatons out altogether and just get rid of them, or make them all play nice. And Jackson, like you said, was reminded of all this. It made him think of Rachel and what had happened to her, and he became incredibly defensive of Peggy Eaton, and basically told them, you all need to like hang around, or else like all get together and play nice, or this can be bad for all of you and all of your husbands. And it was just kind of like a media frenzy, because again, it was kind of like tabloids. You think about that, people just became obsessed with this story because it was salacious. And with all the stuff after the election and all that dying down, it was just something to kind of focus on, and something that was kind of like, I don't know, celebrity drama now. And this led to kind of Jackson actually relying on his cabinet less and less.
Yes.
It resulted in the kitchen cabinet, which was basically just like his kind of core group. And he would kind of consult with them and talk to them outside of regular cabinet meetings. And they were the ones that were probably his closest advisors during his administration.
Which was not exactly a great thing, especially like we talked about the spoil system and all that. And so basically, what happens? The standoff happens it goes on for 2 years, and eventually Andrew Jackson's like, okay, we can't put up with this anymore. And so he asks for all the cabinet members except for one. He asked for if their wives will not associate with Peggy Eaton and John Eaton, then I'm going to force you to resign. And they did. They said, okay, we're out. And so this you mentioned the troubles with his cabinet, and it made him trust them less and less. The numbers are honestly unbelievable. So he fired all 3 secretaries of state during his presidency, by the way, all 3 secretaries of state, 4 secretaries of the Treasury, 2 generals, and 1 secretary of war. And so you're seeing just an upheaval. You can't get any sort of traction in the cabinet, which, like you mentioned, Jackson doesn't really care. And like you mentioned, it's called Jackson's Kitchen Cabinet. And so that's the Battle of Petticoats, the latest chapter in American political drama.
Mm-hmm.
So now we move to 1830, 1 year into his administration, and certainly one of the most tragic affairs happened. Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which would basically force it would evict all Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi, and it directly targeted 5 tribes. They were the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee. Now, the Cherokee tribe pushed back on this. They said they took the state of Georgia to court, and then the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice John Marshall, who's one of the most influential Chief Justices without question in the history of the court, he rules that this piece of legislation is unconstitutional and that the Cherokee can stay. And it was rumored, again, we don't know if he said this or not. Maybe it's the stuff of legend. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not. But supposedly, Jackson remarked after hearing about the Supreme Court's ruling, he said, quote, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Mm-hmm. So he's saying, oh, so you ruled it? I don't care. I'm the man in charge. I guess Jackson kind of thought of himself somewhat as above the law and above the law of the land and above the Supreme Court. And so years of fighting goes on. And then, again, the treaty was eventually enforced by Jackson's successor, who we'll get into later, of course. And tragically, the Cherokee are rounded up at gunpoint, and they are forced to move from Georgia, and their land was seized. And of the 18,000 Cherokees that left, 4,000 died. And this was, of course, known as the Trail of Tears. And just talk about, this is, we talked about with Thomas Jefferson, the biggest stain in his legacy is the Sally Hemings affair. I don't think there's a question. This is the biggest stain on Andrew Jackson's legacy is the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. Talk about that and just the devastating effect once it was all said and done.
I would completely agree that this is the biggest stain on his legacy. So the Indian Removal Act, basically it went in phases. So the first phase was kind of like pack up and go. And it wasn't as much of a forced removal as it was kind of like leave so we don't come and force you to leave. And there were some tribes, like you spoke about with the Cherokee, that chose to fight this. The Creek and the Choctaw, I know, disputed it, but I believe that they didn't actually take it to court. But disputed the removal and went and tried to lobby the White House to basically kind of drop the whole thing, which was not successful. They also tried to lobby state legislatures to try to take actions to protect them, which I know were also unsuccessful. The tribes basically had to march to mostly what is now modern-day Oklahoma. And it was a treacherous journey. They were kind of walking through a lot of what was mostly wilderness. They were walking through towns that were not welcoming to them. And a lot of people that were walking were starving and did not have access to clean water. And it just resulted in a large number of deaths that affected the tribes greatly, especially as they were being forced to settle in land that was not familiar to them. They were settling there, and then also lacking. They were settling in land that was not familiar to them, and they'd also just gone through losing like a large segment of their population.
Yeah.
There were some members of the tribes that actually, in a way, they were definitely a minority, but did kind of welcome it because they thought that it would basically be a way that if they kind of left and went west, that the U.S. government would just leave them alone, which obviously did not happen either. But they thought that maybe this would be like kind of an end to it, that if they left and kind of ceded their historical homelands, that they might be left alone and going to be able to rebuild their nation on their own. And it was just kind of all around. I think it highlights on both sides, kind of the injustices against the Native Americans. I think it shows the way that, they were obviously just within the removal existing in and of itself was an attack on them, and kind of a claim that they cannot be like absorbed into American society. I think the concept that they needed to absorb into like the white society there was an issue, and that was the expectation, that was being held. And then I think on the other side, kind of the view from some natives that, if they do this, if they just leave, then they'll be left alone. And then the fact that, that didn't happen. They weren't just left alone after that. And we broke that promise yet again. And I think it just highlights, one of the kind of original sins of America, and the problem of, kind of fully applying, those rights and protections that are kind of at the core of our country, being able to apply that to everyone. And, the government struggled with that. And I think this is probably one of the greatest examples of it. Obviously in other examples, slavery and the issue of slavery, which will come up not too long from now. Yeah. But it's just one of those. I don't think that the tragedy of the entire situation could be highlighted enough.
Amen, man. I think you're right on the money, and that's, like you mentioned, it's one of the original sins of America is racism towards Native Americans, towards Black people in slavery, and towards other groups of people, women. And so, I mean, that's it was it was bad legislation all the way around. It was bad morality wise. It was bad just across the board, and just a complete utter train wreck that happened because of this decision by Andrew Jackson. And so it's kind of difficult to transition from that. But shortly after this, we've got the South Carolina nullification crisis, which again, like I talked about, and you agree that Andrew Jackson, man, he was always fighting somebody. Sometimes the fight came to him. More often than not, he was the one who started the fights. And so basically began the states becoming angry about the tariff on imported goods because it helped the New England states at the expense of Southern planters. And so, they're mad about this. And in response, they said they had a right to nullify the federal tax. And this was endorsed by the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, himself being, of course, a South Carolinian. And many believe that Jackson might have actually agreed the tax was too high if Calhoun didn't endorse it. But Calhoun was merely picked to balance the ticket, to get Jackson elected in 1828. And he even went so far as to consider him a personal enemy. And so, like I said, he's at war with somebody all the time. And South Carolina even threatened civil war, Jackson threatened civil war against South Carolina. And so just talk about the mess of this and it's honestly kind of a small example, but I guess an example somewhat of what was to come in the Civil War later, when of course South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union.
I think the core issue of the nullification crisis is basically, can a state overrule law set by the federal government? And the answer to that is no. But at the time, we were still kind of figuring out the divide of how much power, how much of the power is divided between the federal government and the states. And we're still kind of figuring that out. I don't think we'll ever be done. They got a clear-cut answer there, but it was less defined than it is now. And South Carolina basically didn't like this law. They couldn't get it changed in Congress, so they basically said, we're just not going to enforce it. It's not the law of South Carolina. And, this caused immense tensions, obviously, because Jackson, being the leader of the federal government, even though he did have some sympathies with South Carolina and with the southern states that were disputing this law, he viewed the Union as being above that. And he viewed the authority of the federal government as being above that of the states ultimately. Now he would have believed in a very, very strong state government, without a doubt, but he believed that ultimately the Union trumped that. And that's kind of where the dispute came. And his vice president, John C. Calhoun, didn't agree with him. And they had a massive falling out that I believe ultimately resulted in Calhoun's resignation. And the most important things out of this crisis is we see Jackson as someone who does see the importance in holding the Union together. And despite kind of his craziness, we see that, he is a patriot. And he knows what he's doing. He knows how to handle a political crisis, even though sometimes he kind of lets his emotions get in the way. I think this is a good example of one where he kind of uses his emotions to his advantage and kind of uses his persona as a crazy person to his advantage, because he kind of says to South Carolina, like, you really want to take this up with me? Like, you really want to fight with me about this? And he works. He basically says, sees who's going to break first, and Jackson isn't going to break, and South Carolina gives in. And but it's also notable because, as you said, we do see kind of the first rumblings of talks of secession from the Union, and obviously this isn't over the core issue of the Civil War, but tariffs did play a role in that, and we're seeing the first of the bend here in South Carolina of a view that preserving the Union is not even like the ultimate
it's not
goal,
of the most importance to them, maybe you would say.
Yes. It's not that big of a deal to them. They're more worried with South Carolina than the nation as a whole. And that's important going forward, especially as we get closer to the buildup of the Civil War.
Yeah, and basically what happens is, like you said, he threatens South Carolina with civil war, knowing that they're not going to, I mean, like you said, you're going to take up you're going to one state against the rest, one state against Jackson's army. And he even went so far as to use his power to threaten to hang John C. Calhoun. And Calhoun, knowing Jackson's like, he may actually be serious about this. And so he's said to be genuinely scared for his life. However, cooler heads prevailed, and South Carolina backs down. They don't take war essentially with the federal government, and the tariff is lowered. And so no war comes out of this, thankfully. And you bring up a really good point, though, about Jackson, about how at the end of the day, as crazy as he was, he did value the Union more than just individual states. He valued the fact that, hey, we can't split apart. We got to keep this thing together, or horrible things could happen. And so I do think he deserves credit for that, at least.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's important. I think it's one of the reasons why, when we do get around to the Civil War, even though Jackson was a Southerner and was very popular in the South, he wasn't someone that was used by Confederates as kind of like a symbol, the way that they tried to kind of reshape, especially the founding era presidents, into symbols of them, which they were twisting their legacies to kind of make it fit their agenda. They didn't do that with Jackson. And, I think the reason for that is basically because they knew without a doubt that he would not have been with them. He would have agreed with their sentiments, but he would not have been in favor of breaking up the Union. And he, in several letters throughout his life, kind of made hints towards that. And especially near the end of his life, there were some letters to some friends that were kind of worried about kind of the rise in abolitionism. And he basically said, like, if we lose that battle, we lose it. Like, the Union's the Union. And I think that that's an important aspect to his legacy, is that he was extremely stubborn, but he also kind of saw the writing on the wall at times.
Sure. I think it's a great point. And so now we come around to a pivotal year, 1832. Number one, it's an election year, so Jackson's running for re-election. And 1832 brings up his most daunting battle since he became the chief executive, and that would be the Bank of the United States. And if this will become known as the Bank War, not a literal war, but a political one. Basically what happens is Congress, Congress basically led by Henry Clay, proposes a bill, or at least revealed the bank's new charter, even though it was not set to expire until 1836. And so Clay proposes on the 4th of July this new charter to Jackson. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is Jackson is probably, again, similar to the whole John C. Calhoun, South Carolina nullification crisis situation. He's probably not opposed to it, until Henry Clay involves himself into it. And Clay was probably Jackson's greatest enemy when he was president. And so Jackson writes a letter. And by the way, Clay was running against Jackson that year. And he was supported by the president of the bank, a man named Nicholas Biddle. And Jackson writes back to, he vetoes the bill, and he stated, quote, "The bill to continue the Bank of the United States was presented to me on the 4th of July. Having considered it with that solemn regard to the principles of the Constitution, which the day was calculated to inspire, and come to the conclusion that it ought not to become law, I herewith return it to the Senate, with which it originated with my objections." Now, this infuriated Biddle. And so talk about the back and forth that goes between not Jackson and Clay, but Jackson and Biddle.
Basically, what I've seen with the bank war and this whole situation was basically just like we're seeing Jackson is kind of getting invigorated with the election and winning re-election. And kind of seeing like he goes back into kind of his view of a popular mandate, that his political agenda is popular with the American people and it's what they want to get done. And it's a mandate that he has to do it. And so he's kind of reinvigorated by that. And with the issue of the bank coming up, what was kind of a sly plan from his opposition to try to get it, to try to kind of protect it before its time, resulted in Jackson basically just kind of going ballistic on it. Because he had always wanted it. He was always against the national bank. That was going back for years. He viewed it as a corrupt system that disadvantaged the common man, which again kind of goes into his larger kind of political beliefs. But he basically just kind of went ballistic on it. And in response to their kind of work to try to protect it, he basically was like, no, we're just going to get rid of it now. And that was one of those things, like, Jackson never did anything. Like, he always did everything 100% with all of his being. He never did anything halfway. And, I think you see this here, and this is a notable situation because this is where we see the rise of the Whig Party, is they basically said, what Jackson's doing here, the way that he's doing this, the way he's acting, is not appropriate. It's authoritarian. It's concerning. We don't like it. And his political opponents kind of formalized themselves, and we saw the Whig Party rise out of this. And you see in kind of that Whig platform, you see key oppositions to kind of Jackson's big main points, and they're still at the same time trying to steal his common man message, which is interesting, and that'll be more important once we move past him.
And Jackson, or excuse me, Biddle compared this to anarchy. He compared Jackson's stance to anarchy because you're saying, wait, you're going against the federal bank. And this war in general, I don't know how much of a factor. You can interrupt me if you choose, if you have anything to prove this incorrect. But basically, this doesn't do much for Clay or against Jackson, at least in regards to the election, because Jackson went on to absolutely crush Clay in 1832. But the bank war it's still not over. And so what happens is Congress is in recess in 1833. And so Jackson ordered his Treasury Secretary, a man named Lewis McLean, to redirect federal deposits from the bank to various state banks, because he didn't want one big bank controlling nation. He wanted the state banks to have more power. And again, Jackson's enemies were absolutely, they were very angry at this because they didn't even know if this was legal, what Jackson was doing. But because of this, McLean was like, no, I'm not going to do it. So Jackson fired him. And so he removed him and tabbed his new Secretary of State, a man named William J. Duane. He doesn't do it. So Jackson fires him. And so basically he now goes to Roger B. Taney as yet another Secretary of the Treasury, and he complied with Jackson to do his bidding. And when Congress returned, found out what Jackson had done, they made him the first president to be censured. But when the Democrats later regained the majority in the Senate, they expunged his censure as if it had never happened. So during this period, basically two major events happened in 1835. So New Year's Day, Jackson pays off the entire national debt, and which is the only time, by the way, in American history that we've been debt free, which
Mhm.
boy, is that not the case today. But that's times have changed. But the second event, 29 days later, it nearly ended Jackson's presidency, and it almost ended his life. So Andrew Jackson's going to the funeral of a South Carolina representative, a man named Warren Davis. And as he's leaving, an unemployed painter named Richard Lawrence fired a shot at Jackson, which missed. And as he pulls out another pistol and fired, he misses again. And so Jackson, at this point, let's see. So he comes in office at 61. So Jackson's 66, 67 years old. He's no young whippersnapper, Isaac, and he proceeds to beat the crap out of this guy, and to the point where they had to actually hold Jackson off from his would-be assassin. And so just talk about this and just the wildness of it.
This is one of my favorite Andrew Jackson stories because I think it just shows his temperament perfectly. He's someone where I think in his personal life, a lot of the times, I wouldn't say this politically, but he was in his personal life. He had a difficult personal life, so you kind of want to feel for him because he's just been assassinated, like almost assassinated, and then he goes up and kind of defends himself, and you're like, okay, like that's fine, but then he takes it way too far, and I think that that's kind of the best way to like kind of just show who Andrew Jackson was. He's someone who wasn't always wrong, and you understand why he believed the things that he did, but he almost always took it too far. And I think like just the absurdness of the story of him almost beating his would-be assassin to death is just entertaining and kind of ironic. But I think it kind of shows just kind of a larger picture of who he was. And I think that it shows a little bit of kind of why he has remained this popular figure in American history. Some of it's because he was viewed as kind of a common man president, and that sticks with people. But I think another part of it is he's someone he's hard to forget. He took things too far. He got riled up. He was very passionate about it. And, I think that resonated with people. And I think that's why that story is a good example of why people remember who he is, even though it's a kind of a humorous example of that.
Yeah, and this is actually the first known attempt on the life of a sitting U.S. president. So, fortunately, Jackson lives. Richard Lawrence spends the rest of his life in insane asylums, and that's that. And so by 1836, the final year of his presidency, the Bank of the United States is dead. It's gone. There's only one small problem. He was so driven to destroy the bank, it was his life's mission almost is what he made it, that he didn't have a substitute for it. He didn't have anything to replace it. And this is a decision that would definitely haunt his successors. And so Jackson's legacy, and talk a little bit about this, it's definitely one of the most complicated and debated legacies in the history of American presidents. We, like I said at the beginning of this series, we tend to agree on the great ones. We tend to agree on the bad ones. Jackson's one of those that's like, where do we stand on this guy? And so he definitely changed the office. He gave it more power without a question due to his personality and his forcefulness. But he's the only president in history to really have an entire age named after him. It's called the Age of Jackson. And you would see a series of Jacksonian-style presidents come after him. And so to kind of talk about, it's kind of broad, but at least his legacy and how he changed the office and how his legacy is still so much debated to this very day.
His legacy has definitely become less favorable in recent years. And that's kind of because of some social changes and kind of more importance on kind of the systemic injustices that were perpetuated while he was president. But I think that, it's important to remember, like, he was someone who, I keep coming back to the common man, but he valued the common man. He wanted to kind of fight for your everyday American. And that's something that we see still a lot in American politics today, and that comes from him. He's the one that kind of originated that idea. He created a lot of the way that our political parties function today, a lot of the way that kind of our government runs today, and kind of some of the traditions and the way that we handle things. Like a lot of those come from Andrew Jackson. And so we see his presidency is one that like has still had a very lasting effect on the way that our government runs and works and the way our political system works. And I think that those are some of the reasons why he's remembered so favorably by so many people. But the hard part with that is that his legacy is so complex because he also, was a proponent of slavery, and he did, the Trail of Tears did start and was carried out mostly under his presidency, and those great kind of injustices are so important, not only in the way that they've shaped America and changed American culture, but also in the ways that they just hurt those people groups. And his successes, though, are also important because they've helped shape our government in ways that are important and have been beneficial to the country as a whole. So I don't think his legacy will ever not be disputed. I don't think you can really easily put him in a good or bad spot. I think on certain issues, lines are very clearly drawn, but I think it's just like Andrew Jackson personally, he was confusing. It was hard to kind of get a good read of him. And, I think that his legacy will continue to be debated for years to come. And I'm not sure that I think the jury's out on Andrew Jackson, and I think the jury might always be out.
That's a good way to put it there at the end. The jury may always be out. And, some look at history and they love Andrew Jackson. Some look at it and they despise him. But again, and this is certainly not common for all presidents, there's many forgettable ones. The one thing you cannot do with Andrew Jackson, you just can't do it. You cannot ignore him. You can't ignore his legacy. You can't ignore how he changed the presidency for better or for worse. And so we now transition to a man who is his successor, his second vice president, Martin Van Buren. Number 8, Martin Van Buren, Democrat, 1837 to 1841, 54 years old, from New York. My bad, before we get into Martin Van Buren, back to Andrew Jackson for just a second because I just forgot about this. He died on June the 8th of 1845. My bad, I forgot about this, people. He was 78 years old. And his, again, back to your point about last words of U.S. presidents, his was quite touching, actually, which is shocking considering the very abrasive man that he was, an abrasive president. But his final words were, "What is the matter with my dear children? Have I alarmed you? Oh, do not cry. Be good children, and we will all meet in heaven." So do you think maybe, and it's tough to debate last words of people, but do you think maybe to a certain degree that he was at peace, that maybe this sort of tumultuous life was coming to an end and he was, going to a better destination?
I think that Jackson at the end of his life, truthfully, and from some of the letters that I've read, I think he was just ready to be reunited with Rachel. Like, I think genuinely that's what he wanted. I think from upon the time of her death until the time of his death, that is what he wanted. And I think that, as his life was kind of drawing to an end, I think that he, I don't think by any means he wanted to die, but I think that he was at peace with it because he knew that, that he would be reunited with her.
It's well put. So, yeah, my bad. I forgot that last part about Andrew Jackson. Now we move to Martin Van Buren. So Martin Van Buren, 1837 to 1841. He was born on December the 5th of 1782 to Abraham Van Buren and Maria Goes Van Allen. He married Hannah Hose in 1807. They had 5 children together. Sadly, 18 years before Martin Van Buren became president, Hannah passed away of tuberculosis. And so he himself, Jackson was kind of the unofficial creator of the Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren actually literally created the Democratic Party, the one that we know today currently. He had somewhat of a reputation for being a little aristocratic, and for those that are watching YouTube, you can see the picture down there. He's got the whiskers, so he's kind of he's very much, and you'll see this kind of used against him later in future campaigns. He's not in any way like Jackson, like a voice for the common man. That's not how his reputation is at all. And he was always well dressed. He had a good sense of humor. So talk about kind of Van Buren's reputation, whether some of it is justified and some of it maybe not so much.
I think that, and when it comes to Martin Van Buren's legacy, I think that it's appropriate to just say that it's kind of forgettable.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, that's well said.
While there were important things that happened during his presidency, they weren't things that I think are super relevant to kind of like today's conversation as much. I think some of the issues of slavery are ones that people are more interested in. But it was just kind of a time. I don't think that he personally was necessarily too unlikable of a guy. I think that for the most part, he had good intentions. But I think he was just kind of like the wrong president at the wrong time. And he just kind of got the short end of the stick. He was kind of viewed as like being a puppet for Jackson, and he just came in during an economic depression and didn't really have friends in Congress, and it just didn't line up for him. So it's like I don't think that he was as skilled in like getting things done through Congress, or at least forceful enough to not care what anybody else thought as Jackson was. And I think that when you go from a roaring lion to a politician, it's kind of disappointing. And I think that he was just kind of underwhelming in Jackson's shadow. And I don't think he wanted to be in Jackson's shadow. And I think even at the time, other people, including his political opponents, didn't want him to be standing in Jackson's shadow. But I think that Jackson was just too large of a figure for that not to happen. And it did. And I think that's kind of why Van Buren is just kind of viewed as being there and not have really done anything like great.
He's more of viewed, I think, as a failure in the sense that not necessarily that his efforts were poor intentioned for the most part, but like you mentioned, he's kind of wrong place, wrong time.
Mm-hmm.
Because 2 months into his administration, we got the Panic of 1837, which
Mm-hmm.
is caused in part by some of the economic policies of Jackson's administration, because basically the state banks refused to convert paper money into gold and silver after running out of hard currency reserves, and other banks followed suit, caused bankruptcy and record unemployment. So right off the bat, I'm sure his approval rating was in the tank, because he comes in and the economy basically collapses. And so it only got worse as time passed. You got another Panic of 1839, which is even worse than the one of 37.
Mm-hmm.
This one was due to a cotton shortage, which was pretty much and it goes back to slavery, but it was basically the rock of the American economy. It pretty much ran it. And so just talk about how Van Buren kind of failed to address it. Like you mentioned, he wasn't a great politician. I mean, he was a good politician, but not necessarily in the sense of that he worked through Congress, certainly as well as Jackson did.
I think for him at the time, with the economic depression, there were a couple problems that kind of loomed for him with dealing with the crisis. One was that, without the national bank, there was less authority that the president had over currency. He couldn't really tell the state banks to do anything. So as opposed to having a national bank, he could have kind of bossed them around a little bit, and he didn't really have that authority, and neither did Congress to tell the state banks what to do to ease the crisis. And then anything else like that, like today, there'd be debates about some form of economic stimulus. That wasn't a thing then, and that
Yeah.
definitely would have had heavy, heavy opposition from Congress from both sides, arguing about whether that was constitutional or not. So he kind of was between a rock and a hard place because there wasn't like a lot at the time that he could do. And in a way that made him look even worse to the public and to Congress because he didn't really have a clear kind of strategy or plan that he proposed to kind of solve it. And, I think he deserves a little bit of leniency there because I'm not sure what he could have proposed that would have worked at the time. But also, when you're a leader and you're in that kind of position, you're called to kind of be prepared for the unexpected, and he just wasn't. And he kind of got the blame for that, especially again in the aftermath of Jackson. People and Jackson supporters kind of looked at him and said, this didn't happen when Jackson was president. This happened when you were president.
Yeah.
And even though I think a lot of the blame of it does go to Jackson's economic policy, which Van Buren was definitely involved in, so he's not off the
Right.
hook.
That's true.
It just it kind of goes back to like wrong place, wrong time. Like I'm not sure what he could have done about it as president at that point. Besides kind of just wait it out. But even then, you're kind of getting blamed for it, and your unpopularity is gonna go through the roof. And I don't think that there was a lot of public understanding over it. And I think one of the main reasons why there wasn't was because he was in the Jackson administration, and he was not raising any alarms saying that abolishing the national bank could be a bad idea or could lead to recession. At the time, he, like Jackson, didn't really care what the result of abolishing the bank would be. So I think, on that, there's reflections of maybe he should have had more of an active role in the Jackson administration than he should have. But once he got into his own presidency with the Depression, it definitely was had a big impact. And I think did directly play into why he was ultimately not reelected. But I think it also, I'm not sure that there was a better outcome for him.
Yeah, and some of that, like you said, is he comes into this, but then you can also say, well, he was Andrew Jackson's vice president through his second term, so you make a good point there. But he's really a perfect example, certainly of that period of, I guess now we can call it the Jacksonian period at least, where he's got all the qualifications. He's the perfect politician, so to speak, but he lacked those key leadership qualities that many before him had, and so you have the situation where, you got the annexation of Texas now after this, and he doesn't even address the issue because he thinks he's going to make slavery even worse. And so, he was a staunch abolitionist, and, Jackson wasn't. But I think that where the two men aligned is they thought they thought possibly that slavery was the biggest threat to the union of the country. And so just kind of talk about his the annexation of Texas and how he, like in many situations, his 4 years, he doesn't really address it. That's really the biggest criticism of Martin Van Buren is he doesn't even really do much to try and stop bad things from happening. So just talk about the annexation of Texas a little bit.
So while Jackson was president, he'd extended diplomatic recognition to what was then the Republic of Texas. But there were some tensions with Mexico that, again, we'll get into later. That has to do more with Polk once we get to him. But basically there was a lot of debate about whether we should just annex Texas and make it a state, because there was kind of pseudo-American and Mexican control over it, which was causing issues. And basically it became a political dispute where one side is basically saying that, they just want to annex Texas to make it a slaveholding state to kind of offset the balance between the North and the South, and basically put two more Southern pro-slavery senators into Congress. And, there was some of that. There was some belief and push for that, but it kind of became a little bit of a conspiracy theory that was rooted in some truth, that it was like this whole plot to try to make to kind of try to strengthen slavery and the control of slaveholders in Congress, which at first there's not really a lot of evidence that that's what the original intent was. But once that kind of started to become brought up and the accusations were thrown, the pro-slavery members of Congress were kind of like, oh yeah, like, yeah, we could do that. Which is a little humorous, but Van Buren's response to the whole dispute was basically to kind of like
do anything.
Yeah, do nothing. Like he didn't really. He just tried to kind of stay out of it and kind of like talked up both sides at different times, but never did anything. And he tried to propose a diplomatic solution to try to like fix a financial dispute between American citizens and Mexican citizens, and maybe hopefully like leave Texas alone and kind of like get us a little less entangled with it. But like that kind of fell through, and it didn't really help the disputes between the Mexican government and the U.S. government and the Republic of Texas. And it was just kind of like he like kind of like fiddled with the issue a little bit, but he like kept a distance from it because he was worried that it would like blow up, and he didn't want to have to pick a side. And that ultimately, politically, it probably would have been better for him if he had just picked a side. But he didn't. He was worried about what that would do to his reelection odds, and whether he would be able to kind of keep his political party together and behind him if he picked a side in that dispute.
Well, he certainly guessed wrong in regards to what the people were gonna think about that as far as his reelection chances in this point. So I think it comes down to Americans, and this is certainly true today. And I don't think I don't know if you could say certainly with some past presidents, it has been a topic of discussion about, where does he really stand on this? Is he just going along with the party? Is he just so? At the time, people are like, where does Martin Van Buren really stand on certain issues, because he's not even acting on them. And so 1840 comes around, the nation's in a full-on depression, and his reelection chances are sunk. He wins the Democratic nomination pretty much by default. And the Whigs, like you mentioned, this new party that's kind of coming up, they could have run almost anybody. Had they known this, Henry Clay probably would have been the nominee, and Henry Clay may have very well become president. This is not what happened. They ran a man named William Henry Harrison, who was known as the hero of Tippecanoe. And the campaign slogan at the time was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referring to his running mate, John Tyler. And so the Whigs chose Harrison because he was sort of, they thought he would be at least, kind of their Andrew Jackson, because he portrayed this image of common man, right? There was the log cabin symbol that was displayed a lot in 1840, which is funny because he was not born in a log cabin. He was very much an aristocrat, which is kind of the irony of the situation. But he was a general. He like Jackson, he fought Native Americans. And so, and above all, he pretty much supported the recharting of the bank. And so talk about this election of 1840 is historic in that it kind of is the first one to feature campaign slogans and sort of, I guess you could say, the theatrics of elections. So talk about how that is significant, at least to present day, like between Harrison and Van Buren.
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the political parties were a little bit more well-formed and had kind of clearly defined themselves in opposition to each other. So it wasn't more of like figuring out where we do and don't agree. Like they already knew that. So now they were going to kind of have fun with it. So like campaign songs have become a big thing. And they were doing like kind of fun campaign events even for the time. It's like one thing that Harrison's campaign did is they had this big like ball, and they would roll it through the towns that they were going through, and people would sing the campaign song, and then they would have a stump speech, and where basically Harrison or Tyler or someone else on the campaign would give a little speech talking about kind of, the common man ideals, and going and driving Van Buren, or as they would call him, probably Little Van, out of Washington. And then they kind of played on what had originally been used to mock him. Originally, the log cabin imagery and the hard cider imagery, which were both used to call him as being like poor and not noble, which is ironic coming from Jackson's common man Democrat Party. And the hard cider, because they were accusing him of being an alcoholic, to kind of attack him. And Harrison's campaign basically said, you're taking these two images and trying to use them against us, but these are popular images. Obviously not the alcoholism, but like hard cider was the common man's drink, and being born in a log cabin was normal for a lot of people. So they were taking what was a much more aristocratic candidate and making him more relatable by accident. And Harrison's campaign leaned into it heavily, and they leaned into him being a war hero, and it worked. People picked up on that, and there was a lot of movement around him and a lot of energy surrounding Harrison's campaign. And Van Buren, when he originally entered office, carried some of that energy that Jackson had, but he didn't have it in the next election. It fizzled out through kind of the lackluster response to the economic depression and other political issues. He just wasn't, and just personally, he didn't keep that energy that Andrew Jackson had, and transferred to someone who could offer it, and that person was William Henry Harrison.
Yeah, and they would give him nicknames. They would nickname Martin Van Buren Martin Van Ruin. They'd say Van, he's a used up man. And so this would basically, the Harrison camp, the Whigs, and those that supported them would attack the policies of the Martin Van Buren and his image as aristocratic and things of that nature, which their candidate was too. Van Buren's camp, pretty much all they had as ammo. And listen, it was. I think I could say it was at least fair, but they went a little too far in this regard. But the gist of it was fair. They would go after Harrison's age. Harrison was an older individual. He was nearing 70, and so they would throw around words like, you know, he's a grandma president and things of that nature. So it wasn't. I don't think it was as nasty as 1828, but certainly we're starting to see more insults that maybe aren't necessarily policy driven being thrown out from one side to the other as a way to get the people more involved. And so election of 1840 happens, and it wasn't even close. 80% of eligible voters went to cast their ballots, and Harrison waxed Van Buren. And so pretty much after the loss, Van Buren goes back to Kinderhook, New York. He follows politics. He stays on top on important issues, and like slavery. And he actually, this is a fun fact. I did not know this. He saw, after he left office, more presidential successors than any man who had ever been president. He saw 8 successors before he passed away, which I think is very interesting. Which he did pass away on July the 24th of 1862. He was 79 years old, and his final words were, "There is but one reliance." I don't know if he was referring to God or something else, but those were his final words. And yeah, I mean, you could say that, I guess the best way to put Martin Van Buren's legacy is it's one of the more forgettable. I mean, if you just throw around the name Martin Van Buren, probably most average people nowadays aren't really going to know who you're talking about. Not much really happened when he was president. And the things that did happen usually weren't very good. And so now we move on to the first Whig president. This is the new party. William Henry Harrison, like we mentioned, he wins in a landslide in 1840. And so let's talk about the what you're going to find out is a very brief history in presidential regard of William Henry Harrison. Number 9, William Henry Harrison, Whig, 1841, 68 years old, from Ohio. So William Henry Harrison, he's born on February the 9th of 1773 to Benjamin Harrison and Elizabeth Bassett. Now, Benjamin Harrison actually signed the Declaration of Independence. And so certainly, I guess you could argue from birth, he's already ingratiated into politics, into this kind of new American dream that came about in 1776. But he married Anna Symes in 1795, and they had 10 children together. And he was the last president. We talked about this. He kind of projected this common man sort of image, which was not true. He was an aristocrat. He was the last president born a British subject, and he's the only president to study medicine. So he was very well educated. He was a very smart man, and he gave his inaugural address, and he wanted to make a point of going at the people on the Democratic side that had attacked his age and said he wasn't fit for office. And so he gave what was the longest presidential inauguration address in American history.
And I think it's notable about that address.
Yeah.
The reason why he gave such a long address was because he didn't want to be defined by that backwoods image. He wanted to be known for being very intelligent. So he wanted to have that popular common man imagery, but he also wanted people to know that he was smart. Like he didn't want people to think he was dumb because of it. And that was part of his intention behind giving such a long address, was to try to kind of promote this image that he wasn't lacking in intelligence because of that.
Right. And he's basically, the speech, by the way, lasted almost 2 hours. So it was a very, very long speech. And he chose to give it on what was a very cold wet, kind of nasty day in Washington. He does not wear a hat. He does not wear an overcoat, and or gloves, by the way. So he's basically just kind of trying to show, I guess, sort of a tough guy image, but also, like you mentioned, trying to show the nation that, yes, I'm a tough guy, but I'm also very intelligent. So I'm basically, I guess I don't think this was his intention at all, but kind of, I got the good qualities of Van Buren, but I've also got some of the good qualities of Jackson. I'm kind of a merge of the two in a way, but this backfired big time because 22 days later, he complained of cold-like symptoms, and the cold later turns to pneumonia. And on April the 4th of 1841, William Henry Harrison became the first president in U.S. history to die in office, and his presidency only lasted 31 days, which is the long, which I think everybody out there would know, the shortest tenure of office in presidential history. And so he was 68 years old, and his final words were, "I wish you to understand the true principles of government. I wish them carried out," as spoken to his doctor. And so this causes a big dilemma for the country, because the founding fathers didn't really think of this. Hey, what happens if one of us dies in office? Who takes over? Who succeeds? And so talk about sort of the real issue that the country faces after Harrison's death.
So there were kind of competing sides in basically who's president now, who governs. And there were really, I would say there were three main camps, although there were a lot of people that were debating kind of different sides and ideas of what could be done. One was through Congress, where they basically said that either there just needed to be a new election, or it should go to the House of Representatives and they should elect someone to be president. Kind of think similar to like 1824 style. So that was one side, and that was fairly popular within Congress because it kind of gave them a little bit more power there that they liked, especially since they were going to be working with the new president. Then you had a view that Tyler should step in, but not as president, that he should be an acting president until the next election cycle. So he would have some of the authority, but not all of it. And he, some states will do this with their governors. If an incumbent governor resigns or dies in office, then the lieutenant governor will kind of step in an acting capacity and kind of run the state until the governor is fully replaced. So there was some talk of having Tyler do that. But then the last group, and this is the one that ultimately won out, was basically pushed by almost exclusively Vice President Tyler. And he basically said, I am president now. I'm the 10th president of the United States. I am the one running the country. This is not an acting capacity. Like, this is what I'm doing now. I'm no longer vice president. I am president. And, he's playing on what he thought was correct from his interpretation of the Constitution and kind of what he believed the founders kind of intended for the role of vice president as more than just the president of the Senate. But he also, I think it's fair to make some arguments that he didn't like the idea of like just being an acting president or kind of having to like try to fight his way into the office. And I think he basically saw that gap and the need for a leader there and jumped on it, for better or worse, which we'll get into in a minute. But going on since then, that succession has now been put into law, and that tradition, and now again, like I said, law comes from Tyler basically saying no, like, I am the president now. And that's probably the most notable thing that came out of Harrison's very short-lived administration, is basically that it established, what do we do if a president dies in office? How do we handle this? And it obviously has changed some over the years, but kind of the tradition with that and the way things are done has been based almost exclusively on this first example. And I think that is the most notable thing, without a doubt, that happened because of Harrison's rise to power.
Yeah, and it's of course, as everybody out there listening or watching knows, maybe not necessarily the number, but we have had 8 after Harrison. We had 8 presidents either die or resign from office, and so in all the cases, the vice president took over. So this was like you mentioned, this was a pivotal chapter in American history. And again, for better or for worse, with John Tyler, this. At the very least, at least this got settled, and we didn't have to really worry about this challenge ever again. As you mentioned, it was put into law. I believe it was in the 60s. Gosh, I'm trying to remember what year it was. It was when Lyndon Johnson became president. I'm trying to remember when it was, but I'm blanking. But it became law about 50, 60 years ago or so. So that happened. And so now off from the very short president, the 31-day presidency of William Henry Harrison, we now move to his vice president, who is now not the acting president, but the real president, John Tyler. Number 10, John Tyler, Whig, 1841 to 1845, 51 years old, from Virginia. So John Tyler was born on March the 29th of 1790 to John Tyler Sr. and Mary Armstead. His father actually was Thomas Jefferson's roommate. And he very much, at least until he became president, he very much believed in states' rights. He was similar to Jefferson in that regard. He believed in states' rights, but also like Jefferson, he takes over as president, and now that he's the man in charge, now all of a sudden the federal government needs to have more power. And so he was kind of a thin individual. He wasn't a very large human being whatsoever. He was kind of stubborn, aloof, and basically he dealt with the issue. He wasn't overly respected right off the bat. He was called his ascendancy, his ascendancy, depending on what side you asked. So talk about John Tyler just as a person, and then as sort of the challenges he deals with right as he comes into office in 1841.
Yeah, he was definitely not a very charismatic person. I think that overall, I'm not sure there's any one character trait about him that really stands out to me in what I've read about him. I think the biggest thing is kind of that, regardless of what character traits he did have, people weren't going to work with him. They were not happy that he had basically said, I'm in charge now. They didn't like that. Most people didn't want him to be in charge. A lot of Whigs didn't want him to be in charge because he was kind of picked to balance the ticket and to try to get some Democrats to vote for the Whigs. He didn't really agree with a lot of Whig policy, and within Congress, he was kind of viewed as someone who was too much of a Whig for the Democrats there and too much of a Democrat for the Whigs there. And that caused a lot of issues for him. But personality-wise, there's never been one thing about Tyler that has really stuck out to me. He's kind of confusing. He doesn't really give a lot away about what he is really thinking and feeling all the time. And I think that goes into his presidency too. His presidency is chaotic and yet also fairly uneventful. And part of that is because, nothing really gets done while he's president. And it's more just kind of a lot of infighting and disagreements between people within his own administration and within Congress and within his own party. And it just doesn't really work out for anyone. And the most notable thing for him is also, kind of the most notable thing for Harrison, which is that, as a result of him, we kind of got the presidential succession system. And, besides that, there's a lot of things to talk about with him, but it's just nothing
relevant maybe today
of incredible substance.
Yeah. Nothing like you said of great substance, and nothing outside of the succession plan that's overly relevant today. He's right off the bat, again, yes, now he's president, but he's still dealing with Harrison's handpicked cabinet. And so these are Harrison's people. These are not Tyler's people. And this becomes very apparent from the very first meeting. So the first meeting, the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, he told the president that the cabinet, would make all the executive decisions because they were still like, you weren't elected to this position. We were chosen by Harrison. You were just chosen just to balance the ticket and to get our guy elected. And so they say, we're more like Harrison. The people elected Harrison. We should make the decisions. Now, John Tyler, of course, is not overly fond of this. And he responded by saying, quote, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen. I am very glad to have my cabinet such able statesmen as you have proved yourselves to be. And I shall be pleased to avail myself of your counsel and advice. But I can never be consent to being dictated as to what I shall or shall not do. I, as president, shall be responsible for my administration. I hope to have your hearty cooperation in carrying out its measures. So long as you see fit to do this, I shall be glad to have you with me. When you think otherwise, your resignations will be accepted." And so he's basically, in a nutshell, he's saying, if you want to cooperate with me, great, let's do this. If not, get out. So this is a big problem because you've already got infighting between the cabinet and now the new president. And what happens after this is kind of unprecedented. I don't think it's ever happened since. Congress passes two laws. The Whigs, which control Congress, they passed two laws establishing a new national bank. And Tyler, Harrison would have absolutely signed the bill. Like, based on what he said in his campaigns and what he ran off of, he would have absolutely signed the bill. This is what he ran off of. Tyler, however, vetoed both bills. And so everything that they hoped to accomplish through Harrison's presidency was dashed when Tyler becomes president and vetoes these two bills. And after the second veto, the Whigs hold a meeting in which they basically kick Tyler out of the party. So for the rest of his term, he is a president with no party. So this is, again, unprecedented. And just talk about how, like you mentioned, that not much got done. And this was probably a direct result of this decision by the Whigs, correct?
Yes, it was kind of, everyone hated him. And it really does go back again to, him kind of stepping up and saying, I'm in charge. Because, the Democrats, which ultimately he did agree more with the Democrats, and especially after the Whigs disowned him, he drifted more towards them. They didn't want him, though. He was not popular among the people. He was not popular among the Democrats in Congress. They didn't really like him. They, again, didn't like the way that he kind of assumed the full office of the president. They viewed it as kind of concerning and power hungry. And they didn't, and a lot of Democrats viewed him as being kind of a little bit of a traitor for having gone and joined the Whigs when their party was formed. But most Whigs would have basically said that he was never a Whig, that he didn't really believe the things that the party stood for, and that he wasn't really interested in preserving the Whig party, that he was kind of just following the political winds to what he thought was going to be successful for him. And, if that's what he was doing, which is disputed, and I think there is some evidence for that. But if that is what he was doing, it worked. He wound up as president. But it didn't really work out in his favor because it ended his political career. No one wanted to work with him. No one wanted to claim him. And, as he offended the Whigs by not following through on what was in their party platform and on what Harrison had run for and run on, they just didn't want him. And they wanted him to know that they didn't want him. And they wanted the people to know they didn't want him. Because they knew, basically, if the only president that we've actually had in here who has lived long enough to do anything does the exact opposite of what our party is claiming to want to do, we're never going to get elected again. So that they kind of viewed it as a, just kind of take the L on John Tyler and hope that you do better next time. And that's what the Whigs tried to do.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, you point out, he was really, above all, he was kind of an opportunist. Whatever, like you said, worked in his favor, he kind of swayed. He never really held strong to very many particular issues. There were, however, there were some accomplishments that he made in foreign policy. One of those was the Webster and Ashburton Treaty, which settled the border dispute between the United States and Canada, because Canada was still a British possession. Now, on the other hand, you got the annexation of Texas still, and Tyler made a decision to sign a treaty with Texas, but the Senate rejected it. Now, Tyler, is persistent, and he asked for a joint resolution of Congress, which passed. And so this didn't really do much to help Tyler's image. He married Julia Gardner in 1844. There's actually, are you aware of the story of how he met Julia Gardner?
I'm not sure, actually.
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he was on, and to the history buffs listening or watching, please correct me on social media if I'm wrong on this. But basically, I think they were on like some sort of boat or something, and there was like a bombing. It killed some people. Actually, Dolly Madison was on the boat as well with President Tyler, and Julia Gardner, her father, was among those killed. Tyler kind of had sympathy for her, and essentially that's kind of what started their relationship. They got married in 1844, which made him the first president to get married while still in office. But he didn't run for re-election because obviously the Whigs kicked him out. And as you mentioned, the Democrats really didn't trust him much. So he goes by, he passed the rest of his term pretty quietly. And he had 7 children with his new wife. And as of, again, this second episode is being recorded in December. So this very well could have possibly changed by the time this is aired. But he actually is, you got to realize, John Tyler was president in the early 1840s. He died in 1862. 1862. He still is a living grandson, not great-grandson, grandson. So I think that's very interesting. I was telling somebody about that the other day. They were like, grandson? Not great or great? Nope. Let's see. He was Harrison Ruffin Tyler, who currently is 93 years old at the time of this recording. So I think that's definitely a fascinating thing about Tyler. Now, let's just say that if his presidency does not help his legacy as an individual or as a politician, let's say his post-presidency makes it even worse. Because he is, as the Civil War approaches, and we'll get into this obviously more in the next episode, we talk about Lincoln, he comes in and pretty much joins the Confederates. And he's elected to the House of Representatives in the Confederates, but before the first session could open, he died on the January the 18th of 1862 at the age of 71. His final words were, "Perhaps it is best." He was responding to a doctor, hoping that he wasn't going to die. And he is, and this is really kind of the literally and figuratively the nail in the coffin of his legacy. He's the only president in history to have a Confederate flag draped over his casket at his funeral.
He's the only president to have had there was no recognition in DC upon his death. And I think that in a way it's a little symbolic of maybe his presidency as a whole, in the way that he wasn't well liked there. But I think that without a doubt, the largest stain on John Tyler's legacy is not his inaction or inability to get things done. It's at the end of his life, him choosing to leave the Union and to support the Confederates. His legacy is one that I think, as a president, has not been well defined because there's not much to define. His role in kind of helping expand the role of the vice president has been praised. But at the end of his life, there's not a lot that can be defended. There's not a lot you can do to defend a former U.S. president siding with a rebellion against the United States.
Bingo. That's it right there. And I think it is safe to say that his reputation is not exactly going to make any sort of comeback anytime soon. Because, like you mentioned, you put it perfectly. You've got a U.S. president who goes against the U.S. and sides with the Confederates. At bottom line, all to own people. That's what it comes down to. So, John Tyler, this may be my harshest criticism of a president to this point, but if I had to use one word to define him, traitor. That's what I would use. And so that's the presidency of John Tyler. Now we get to our next elected president. This is the last president we're going to talk about on this episode, a man named James K. Polk. He was a little known guy. He was somewhat of a dark horse candidate who pretty much caught everybody by surprise and became the 11th president of the United States. Number 11, James K. Polk, Democrat, 1845 to 1849, 49 years old, from Tennessee. So James K. Polk was very much a Jacksonian. He pretty much modeled his whole political career and certainly his presidency to sort of what Jackson didn't finish, or what Jackson started, I'm going to finish. That was kind of his MO. He was born on November the 2nd of 1795 to Samuel and Jane Polk. He married Sarah Childress in 1824. They had no children together. He was certainly, as a president, he's what we would probably consider somewhat of a workaholic today. He works very long hours. He made himself, again, he tried to be as much like Jackson as possible. So he would make himself available to the public twice a week as president. Now, people may not know this, but Isaac, you can talk about this if you want. How accessible that some presidents at that time were to the people. I mean, like you could go in the White House. Of course, you'd have to pretty much wait your turn, and you can go and speak to the president about certain issues. So talk about that and how very much it is not like that today.
So at the time, and this really was the expectation going up into around the world wars, that the presidents would basically, the White House was open to the public because it was the people's house. It still is the people's house. But, if it's the people's house, then they should have full access to it. The president is just merely residing there for as long as the people allow them to. And, as a result of this, the First Lady's role as the White House hostess was, expanded on in ways different so than now, where the First Lady would have been expected to greet guests as they were coming in throughout the day and make sure that they were being tended to as they waited to speak with the president or as they mingled with other staffers or visitors. And, for access to the president outside of cabinet meetings, or if they were doing some kind of official work and could not be bothered, they were almost frequently being bombarded with guests who were coming to discuss all kinds of issues with them, from local community issues where they wanted them to kind of intercede and contact their government officials and say, hey, the president wants you to do this, or just to kind of lobby the president to take action on different measures, or to lobby Congress to do something. That was pretty commonplace. Again, that change, the first major change in that would have come after the assassination of President Lincoln. But really, the time when that really changed came around World War One, which is something that we can discuss when we get to Woodrow Wilson. But at the time, Polk, Jackson, all of these presidents would have been expected to have been that transparent and open with the public. And Polk, I think, is interesting for this because he was very open, but he was not particularly a people person from what I've read. He was not very extroverted and didn't really enjoy going to the fancy events and things, which is something that Jackson didn't always like, but he enjoyed it a lot more than Polk did. But at the same time, from the descriptions I've read of him, he wasn't necessarily someone that was cold either. Like, people enjoyed being around him, but they could kind of get the sense that he wasn't really interested.
Yeah, I mean, he was. That's a good point. I was going to get into the sort of his personality a little bit. I mean, he was, I guess, devious would be kind of the word to use to describe James K. Polk. He was not. I mean, he didn't hate being around people. He wanted to portray himself as a people president, as a people. He was more of a people president, I guess you could say, than a people person. And so you have that, but he had gas lights installed in the White House so he could work through the night. Again, he from the beginning, he said, I'm only going to serve one term. Like he made that promise. He kept that promise, of course. But he was the first president to tell the heads of all the departments to not send the budget to Congress, but to send them to him, which I think is interesting. But his whole agenda, his whole view. He called it America's manifest destiny. That's what he called it. And it was about how the country needed to expand to the Western Territory. He had 4 specific goals in mind, and they were that he wanted to settle the controversy between the United States and Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. He wanted to bring California into the Union, set up an independent treasury to fix the credit issue that had not been resolved since Jackson's Bank War. Of course, we talked about the panics of 1837 and 39 under Van Buren. And finally, he wanted to lower tariffs on imports into the American economy. And of course, we saw that with the South Carolina nullification problem in Jackson's administration. So basically, to achieve his goals in regards to the economy, he pressures Congress into lowering the federal tariff and establishing an independent treasury, which did in fact succeed. And so he also settled the Oregon issue as well. So talk about how he achieved each and every one of these goals. And he proposed these goals. He promised 4 years. To his credit, he pretty much kept these promises.
I think one way that for the things that he had to lobby Congress about, one was he was helped by there being large Democratic majorities at the time, especially when he first entered the office. They swept, and that did have to do with some unpopularity with Tyler, kind of a bad look on the Whigs. But he was persistent as well. He was good at having his wife invite the right people to different parties at the White House, and kind of getting them on board by kind of buttering them up to his agenda and to him. So he did well with that, and kind of being able to get people on board. Invoking Jackson's legacy was something also helped him a lot too, because that's kind of what all the Democrats were about then, was kind of, we are the party of Jackson even then. And while they were transitioning out of that, he was able to kind of provide that transition by saying, let's kind of finish what he started. And then, I think, I don't want to get ahead of us here, but, the Mexican-American War is probably the most notable thing during his presidency. And I think, with his kind of 4 points and what he wanted to get done and everything, I think the thing about him that kind of stands out to me is that this plays into kind of his character, him being a workaholic, and everything. He got all 4 of those points done. Like, he did all 4 of those things. So it wasn't even just that he got to and he knew he was going to. And upon entering office, he said, I'm only serving 1 term because I'm going to have all of this done. And he got it all done. And he was kind of, by the time we get to the end of his term, he was kind of okay with that. Like, he was happy to leave. He liked being president. From what I've read, he enjoyed the job, but he was kind of like, I did what I wanted to do. That's it. And I think that that's something that is really interesting about him. I'm not sure that everything he did, especially, again, when we get to the Mexican-American War, was necessarily justified. But I think it's interesting. He came in, he kind of did what he had to do. He kind of came up with strategy. He got all the members of his cabinet on board with what he wanted to do. And he just kind of pushed and fought until it got done. But he did it quietly. So, when it came to politics, he would invite the right people to parties, but he wouldn't, cause a big fuss about it the same way that, Jackson would have. He would have kind of quietly tried to befriend them and then have gone, yeah, it'd be really nice if we got this done. I've really wanted to do this. While Jackson would have kind of just, busted into the room and said, hey, I'm going to do this. Get on board.
Whether you like it or not.
Yeah. And I think that is interesting. I think that Polk is a good representation of kind of the transition the Democrat Party of the day was going through. They were becoming quieter and more calculated while still kind of keeping the same principles that Jackson had kind of set for them.
That's a good point. And he's kind of he's got the Jackson policies. He's got the Jacksonian, not the persona, obviously, but the man of the people sort of reputation, and that's kind of his goals. But he is, in some ways, a very effective politician in working with people on both sides and being able to sort of, like you said, very slowly, not come in and say, this is my agenda and this is what we're going to, kind of, ease them into it, which I think is really smart. So, like you said, Polk is in that group of presidents. I'm trying to think of another good example that's not coming to my head right now. But but he's kind of in that group of presidents that maybe don't come to the top of our head when we're thinking about great presidents. But I mean, to his credit, and like you said, some decisions he made were questionable. But listen, you can't say that the man was a liar. I mean, he comes in and does what he needed to do, and he left. He served one term, and he declined to run for a second term, and he and his wife returned to their plantation in Nashville. And James K. Polk actually had what is still the shortest presidential retirement in American history. At only 3 months and 11 days, he died on June the 15th of 1849. He was only 53 years old. He was the youngest president to die, I believe, until John F. Kennedy. And so pretty much he leaves office and he's dead 3 months later. And his final words were spoken to his wife. He said, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you." And Sarah lived, I think, almost 50 years longer than him after that. So he died young. She lived a long life. So that's sort of I guess, one of the more forgotten successful presidencies is James K. Polk.
And I think it's interesting that he's forgotten. I think some of it goes back to kind of how I've already described him being a little bit quieter in demeanor. And I think, just the concept of a president that comes into office and says what they want to do, does it, and then leaves is not something that really happens that often. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be, because they were saying that to get elected. It could be that, the issues of the day change or something is thrown at them that, they weren't expecting, that kind of changes the way that they have to act as president. But Polk didn't really have that. He came in, it was fairly steady times, and he was able to kind of tackle that agenda and kind of complete it without interruption. And I think that he is unique in that. I would have trouble thinking of a president who was able to come in and just get done what they wanted to get done the way that Polk did. I think that if we said that Van Buren was the wrong place at the wrong time, then I think James K. Polk, again, I think there are some questionable things. I'm not sure if he was necessarily the right person all the time, but he was at least in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, that's, like you said, he wasn't necessarily the most likable person in the world, but he was definitely an effective president. He's a good example of one who had a quiet term, but in a good way. There wasn't a ton of chaos outside of the Mexican-American War. Outside of that, for the most part, a quiet and successful 4-year term. And but no, that's the presidency of James K. Polk. So we covered 6 presidents today, and kind of I asked you your takeaway on the founding fathers, our first episode. So this one, we're talking about Adams through Polk. What's kind of your takeaway as far as this sort of era of presidents and how it's transitioned us into probably the most pivotal time in American history?
I think that there are kind of 3 main things I can think of. One is we've seen the nation move west. I think we see that some in the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears and pushing Native peoples west. But we also obviously see it in the Mexican-American War, where Western territories were claimed from Mexico and through the annexation of Texas. And so we see that kind of manifest destiny fulfilled, America moving west. I think that's one thing that we see. I think another key takeaway from this time period is, we're seeing the American government has kind of been fully established at this point. Even though the spoil system was not a good thing, we have the spoil system. We have, the precedent set by Tyler with the vice presidency. We have the American government has kind of been fleshed out, and we can kind of see it in its wholeness and its functioning most of the time, and it's all come together. And then the third thing I would say is we've seen a shift in who the American people want as president. They want a common man. And even though not all of the people elected in this era were common men, they were at least feigning being common men. And I think that's really important. And that's something that's going to stay with America for the rest of the story.
And that's, I think, not just in the presidency. I think in a lot of I think in a lot of groups, movements, and organizations, I think that sort of Jacksonian type or reputation or representation of a person is still continues to this day. Like, you want somebody who's for the people, right? Like that's what we hear even this day, not just in politics. And so this was, like you said, it was a very, very important time in American history, not necessarily outside of Jackson, somewhat of a forgotten time. But we had some very effective presidents. We had some that weren't so much. And so, like I said, episode 3, man, it's a big one, man. It's a tough one. The probably the most difficult chapter in American history and the most pivotal, I would think, in American history coming up in this 3rd episode. So, Isaac, until then, appreciate you coming on the show once again, and we'll see you for episode 3.
Yes, thank you again. I've really enjoyed it so far.
Absolutely. All right, that is Isaac Lawson. Episode 2, I mean, that's he makes some great points. We see those 3 transitions. The country moves west due in large part to James K. Polk's decisions that he does make. And then you obviously have the government's more stable. We have 2 parties at this point. We're actually going to have a new party that's going to come in this 3rd episode that is still coming today. I think by this point, you guys probably know what I'm talking about. But you have that. And you just see a transition. The people want to see the common man as their leader. And there are presidents after this that are sort of elected to kind of be that. And when it was all said and done, a man who really wasn't that as far as his persona, but really wasn't his personal life, changed the nation. And you will, of course, see that in episode 3. So with that is all the time we have for today's episode. Appreciate everybody watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, Anchor, as well as wherever you listen to your podcast. So until episode 3, this is the Carving It Up U.S. Presidents Edition with Isaac Lawson, with me, Bryson Carver. So have a great day. God bless you all. Peace out.